In 1936, a coal miner's wife in Logan County, West Virginia, served her family a Sunday supper that would be illegal to sell in 17 states today. She didn't know it was illegal because in 1936 it wasn't. The government had not yet decided that the food keeping her family alive should be regulated. Number 18 on this list was outlawed by the FDA in 1960 for causing cancer in laboratory rats, fed it in concentrations no human could ever eat. Number 9. The meat at its center will get you arrested in 49 states if you cook it the way your great-grandmother did. And number 3, the most common Depression-era beverage in rural America was killed by a single federal regulation that erased a 200-year-old tradition overnight. Hit subscribe. Let us count down the 25 illegal Depression-era recipes the government hopes you forget. Number 25, poke salad. Across Appalachia in the 1930s, this was the first wild green of spring, and it kept families from getting scurvy after a long winter with no vegetables. Children were sent into the holler with paper sacks to gather young pokeweed shoots before they grew taller than 6 inches and turned toxic. The whole plant is toxic when raw. Every leaf, every berry, every root. Eat it wrong and it will put you in the hospital. Mothers boiled the leaves 3 times, draining and refilling the pot each round until every last trace of the toxin called phytolactotoxin was leached into the rinse water. Then they fried what was left in bacon grease and stirred in a scrambled egg. Today, it is illegal to sell pokeweed in interstate commerce. The FDA classifies the plant as toxic, and most farmers' markets will not allow it. But in 1934, a mess of poke salad with a hot wedge of cornbread on the side cost nothing and tasted like the first warm day of the year. The grandmothers who cooked it knew exactly which boil killed what. Number 24, mock apple pie. In 1934, a homemaker in Iowa baked an apple pie without a single apple in it, and it tasted close enough to fool every man at the table. The trick was Ritz crackers, a brand new product introduced that same year. 20 crackers, crushed coarse and layered into a pie shell, were soaked with a syrup of boiled water, sugar, cream of tartar, and lemon juice, then dusted with cinnamon and topped with a lattice crust. The pie baked for 1 hour at 425 degrees Fahrenheit, and the crackers swelled and dissolved into something that had the exact texture of cooked apple slices. Apples cost 12 cents a pound during the worst of the Depression, when you could find them. A box of Ritz cost 19 cents, and it made 2 pies. The recipe was printed on the back of the cracker box for 40 years. Mothers who served it never told the children. They only told the truth decades later at Thanksgiving, when their grown sons admitted Mom's apple pie was the best in the family. It was not apple. It was desperation, dressed up so well that nobody knew the difference. Number 23, chicory coffee. When real coffee climbed to 50 cents a pound in 1933, families in the South dug up the roots of the wild chicory plant, a blue-flowered roadside weed, and turned them into a coffee substitute that some people swore was better than the original. The roots were washed, sliced, and roasted in a skillet over the wood stove until dark and brittle, then ground in the same hand mill used for coffee beans. Brewed in a percolator, the result was a thick, dark, almost chocolatey liquid with no caffeine and a flavor that tasted of burnt earth and molasses. New Orleans families had been drinking chicory blended with coffee since the Civil War, but during the Depression, the chicory stood alone. A pound of dried roots dug from a single ditch could last a household 2 months. Modern coffee shops now sell chicory blends for $15 a bag and call it a Louisiana tradition. In 1934, it was the bitter brown cup a tenant farmer drank at 4 in the morning before walking 3 miles to the cotton field. Number 22. Dandelion wine. Every yard in America had it growing for free. The dandelion was a weed to most, but to a Depression-era housewife, it was a vintage in the making. Children were paid a penny a quart to gather the yellow blossoms in May, picked at noon when the sun had opened them fully. Mothers steeped the petals in boiling water for 3 days, then strained the liquid, added sugar, lemon, an orange, and a cake of yeast, and sealed the whole thing in a stoneware crock under a layer of cheesecloth. 6 months later, the wine came out the color of pale honey, slightly sweet, faintly floral, and roughly 12% alcohol. During Prohibition, this had been a federal crime. After Prohibition ended in 1933, home production for personal use became legal, but only up to 200 gallons a year, only for the head of household, and only if you did not sell a drop. A dandelion wine sold to a neighbor was still a federal offense. Plenty of grandmothers committed it anyway, every Saturday, for a nickel a bottle. Number 21. Pine needle tea. The white pine that grew across the northern states was free, evergreen, and rich in vitamin C. It had 5 times more vitamin C, ounce for ounce, than a fresh orange. During the Depression, when citrus was a luxury most families could not afford, mothers in Maine, Wisconsin, and Minnesota cut a small handful of fresh green needles from the tip of a young branch, chopped them coarsely, poured boiling water over them, and let them steep for 10 minutes. The result was a pale yellow tea with a clean, piney flavor, slightly resinous and a little sweet. It prevented winter scurvy in households that could not afford fresh fruit from October to April. Today, foraging on most public land requires a permit, and several pine species, including the yew, are toxic and can cause miscarriage or worse. The Federal Forest Service now restricts collection in nearly every national park. In 1932, a kettle of pine needle tea was the cheapest source of vitamin C in America. Today, it is something most people are afraid to try without a guidebook and a lawyer. Number 20. Lard sandwiches. This is the meal that breaks people when they hear about it, and yet it kept millions of American children fed through the Depression. 2 slices of white bread, a heavy spread of pure rendered pork lard, a sprinkle of salt, sometimes for Sunday a dusting of brown sugar on top. That was lunch. Hand it to a child, send them off to school, and they had 800 calories of pure energy in a paper sack. Lard was practically free in farm communities, since every household that butchered a hog rendered the fat themselves and stored it in stoneware crocks for the entire year. 1 pound of fresh lard cost 6 cents at the corner store in 1933. Bread cost a dime. The whole meal came out to roughly 2 cents per child. We have spent 80 years convincing ourselves that animal fat is the enemy. Recent studies have walked back almost every claim made against saturated fat in the 1970s. The grandmothers who fed their kids lard sandwiches were not poisoning them, they were keeping them alive. Number 19, roadkill possum and sweet potatoes. Strict laws now govern the eating of roadkill. Most states require a permit, a tag, and a wildlife officer's inspection before you can legally take a deer struck by a car. In 1933, none of that existed. A possum hit on a country road at dawn was supper by sundown. The animal was skinned and gutted, then parboiled in salty water with a sliced onion to draw out the gaminess. It was roasted in the oven on a bed of sweet potatoes for 2 hours. The possum fat rendered down into the potatoes, which caramelized at the edges and became almost candy sweet. Possum fat is unusual. It is softer than beef fat and renders cleaner than pork, and it carries flavor in a way that nothing else in the wild does. 23 states now criminalize the consumption of unpermitted roadkill. The reason given is food safety. The reason in practice is that wildlife agencies want to track every animal on every road. In 1934, a man who passed a fresh-killed possum without picking it up was a man who did not understand his own family's hunger. Number 18. Sassafras tea. Here is the recipe the federal government literally outlawed. Sassafras root tea was the most common Depression-era spring tonic in rural America, brewed in nearly every Appalachian household from West Virginia to North Carolina. Mothers dug the roots of the young sassafras tree in late winter, scrubbed them clean, and simmered the bark in a kettle of water until the liquid turned a deep, reddish brown, and the kitchen filled with a smell somewhere between root beer, cinnamon, and pine. Sweetened with a little honey, it was served warm to children for thinning the blood after a long winter on heavy food. Then, in 1960, the FDA banned safrole, the active compound in sassafras, after a study showed it caused liver tumors in rats that were fed massive doses for life. The ban applied to commercial sales of sassafras root and oil, and it is still the law today. Every commercial root beer in your grocery store contains artificial sassafras flavoring because the real thing is illegal. Meanwhile, 3 generations of Americans drank sassafras tea every spring of their lives and lived to see 90. Make of that what you will. Number 17. Wild rabbit pot pie. In 1933, the Federal Department of Agriculture launched a campaign called the Domestic Rabbit Project, urging Americans to raise rabbits for their backyards. Wild rabbits, however, were a different story. A man with a .22 caliber rifle could fill a burlap sack with 3 or 4 cottontails in an afternoon and feed his family for 2 days. The rabbits were skinned and gutted on the back porch, jointed into pieces, and simmered for an hour in salted water with a chopped onion until the meat fell from the bone. Then the broth was thickened with flour, mixed with diced potatoes and carrots, poured into a pie shell, and topped with a lattice crust. Baked for 30 minutes at 400 degrees, it came out golden and trembling with rich gravy oozing through the lattice. Today you need a small game hunting license in every state and a permit to take rabbits during certain seasons. In some counties, you cannot shoot one within 500 feet of an inhabited dwelling. In 1933, you shot one wherever you found it, and the children ate first. Number 16. Acorn flour bread. The white oak tree that grew along every fence line in the Midwest produced thousands of acorns each fall, and a single mature tree could yield close to 50 pounds of edible flour after processing. Native Americans had been making acorn bread for centuries, and during the Depression, Midwestern farmers rediscovered the technique out of necessity. The acorns were shelled, soaked in cold water for 3 days to leach out the bitter tannins, then dried and ground in a hand mill. The resulting flour was the color of dark coffee, with a sweet, almost nutty flavor. Mixed half and half with wheat flour, it baked into a dense, dark loaf that tasted of forest and earth. Today, foraging on national forest land requires a permit, and many state parks prohibit the collection of any nuts or seeds for commercial use. Acorns gathered from public land in most states cannot be processed into food sold at any market. In 1934, a Missouri farmer with a sack of acorns and a hand mill could feed his family bread for a week. Now, you would need a lawyer. First pattern break. Here is what nobody wants to admit. The food regulations passed between 1938 and 1980, including the FDA Food, Drug and and Cosmetic Act, the federal meat inspection laws, the ban on raw milk crossing state lines, and the criminalization of unpermitted foraging were not primarily about safety. They were about commerce. A grandmother who grew her own food, hunted her own meat, foraged her own greens, and cured her own pork belly was a grandmother who bought nothing from a grocery store. Every regulation passed in the post-Depression era pushed Americans further away from the kind of self-sufficiency that defined the 1930s. The bigger story is not that these recipes are illegal now. It is that the system was deliberately built to make them illegal. Self-sufficiency was a problem that had to be solved. The solution was to convince an entire country that the food its grandmothers ate was dangerous, primitive, and best left to history. We bought the story. Then we wondered why food costs us a third of our paychecks. Number 15. Carp cakes. The Mississippi River and every flooded farm pond from Iowa to Louisiana was full of carp during the Depression, a bony, bottom-feeding fish that nobody else wanted. Sport fishermen called them trash fish. Working families called them dinner. The trick was the bones. Carp have a Y-shaped bone structure that makes them nearly inedible if filleted normally. So mothers boiled the whole fish for an hour, then picked the meat off the bones in flakes, mixed it with cracker crumbs, an egg, diced onion, and a spoonful of mustard, and fried the patties in lard until they were golden on both sides. The flavor was mild, almost sweet, and the texture was identical to the salmon patties that became popular 20 years later. Carp are now considered an invasive species in much of the country, and several states make it illegal to transport live carp across county lines without a permit. A fish that fed millions of poor families in 1934 is a fish most Americans won't even touch today. Number 14. Pigeon pie. The passenger pigeon went extinct in 1914, but the rock dove, the pigeon you see in every American city, was a different bird and a popular food source through the 1930s. In Pittsburgh, in Philadelphia, in St. Louis, fathers caught pigeons under bushel baskets, propped up with sticks, baited with corn, on rooftops and in alleys. The birds were plucked and gutted right there on the back step. 6 pigeons made one pie. The breast meat was simmered with onion, carrot, and a glass of cheap red wine until tender, then thickened with flour and poured into a pie shell with a lattice top. Baked for 45 minutes, it came out dark, savory, and rich, with a flavor closer to duck than chicken. Today, every American city has ordinances against catching pigeons in public spaces, and several federal regulations under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act protect specific dove and pigeon species. The bird that fed Depression-era city families is now legally untouchable in most jurisdictions. Meanwhile, fancy restaurants in New York serve farm-raised squab for $48 a plate. The poor knew the secret first. Number 13. Turtle soup. Snapping turtles were the prize. A 20-pound snapper pulled from a pond with a baited hook on a long line yielded enough meat for a soup that fed a family of 8 for 2 days. The cleaning was the hard part and the dangerous part, since a freshly killed snapper's jaws can still bite an hour after death. The meat was cut from the 7 different muscle groups, simmered with onion, celery, and carrots for 3 hours until tender, then thickened with a roux and seasoned with sherry, lemon, and a hard-boiled egg sliced in. The flavor was somewhere between veal, chicken, and lobster, and the texture was extraordinary, silky, tender, rich. Turtle soup was a Depression delicacy in Pennsylvania, Dutch country in Louisiana, and in the river towns of the Midwest. Today, several turtle species are federally protected and most states require a special permit to take any turtle for food. The snapping turtle is still legal in some states, but the regulations are dense, the seasons short, and the whole tradition has nearly died. In 1934, you ate what swam in your pond. Number 12. Lamb's quarter and dock greens. Two of the most common roadside weeds in America, lamb's quarter and curly dock, were also two of the most nutritious greens a Depression-era family could eat. Lamb's quarter contains more iron than spinach and more calcium than kale. Dock contains so much vitamin A that a single cup, properly cooked, supplies more than the daily requirement. Both grew wild in every ditch and fence line in the country, free for the taking. Mothers picked the young leaves before flowering, washed them 3 times, and boiled them with a piece of fatback for an hour until tender. The pot liquor was mineral-rich and faintly sour, and the greens themselves had a flavor close to spinach, but earthier. Today, foraging in most public parks is illegal without a permit, and many municipalities spray roadside weeds with herbicides that make them inedible. The cheapest, most nutritious greens in America have been chemically poisoned and legally locked away from the people who once depended on them. A meal that cost nothing in 1934 is now functionally inaccessible to anyone who does not own land. Number 11. Squirrel Brunswick stew. Brunswick stew started in Virginia or Georgia, depending on which historian you trust, and the original version was made with squirrel, not the chicken or pork that defines the modern version. A hunter brought home 4 or 5 gray squirrels on a Saturday morning. The animals were skinned, jointed, and simmered with diced potatoes, lima beans, corn, tomatoes, and onion for 3 hours, until the meat fell from the bone and the broth thickened into something close to a gumbo. The flavor of squirrel is darker than chicken, slightly sweet, and intensely concentrated. A single animal carries more flavor than a whole hen. 6 squirrels in a stew pot fed 12 people. Today, squirrel hunting requires a small game license in every state, with bag limits, season restrictions, and weapon restrictions. In some urban counties, it is functionally banned. Meanwhile, restaurants in Virginia have started selling heritage Brunswick stew with farm-raised rabbit, substituting for the squirrel, charging $22 a bowl. Your great-grandfather caught dinner with a .22 and a tree branch and called it Tuesday. Here is the part that should bother you. The recipes on this list are not illegal because the food is dangerous. They are illegal because the food is free, or because the food bypasses every middleman in the modern grocery supply chain, or because the food, made the old way, does not generate sales tax, does not require a label, does not show up on a USDA inspection report. The Department of Agriculture spends roughly $28 billion a year administering the regulations that govern American food. Almost none of that money is spent protecting consumers from the kinds of food on this list. The protections that exist for foraging, for raw milk, for home slaughtered meat, for wild game, for home fermented alcohol, those protections are designed to channel food production through licensed, taxed, inspected commercial operations. The grandmother who lived off her own land was a problem to be solved. We are still living inside the solution. Every grocery bill you pay is a receipt for a system designed to replace the recipes your great-grandparents made for free. Number 10. Venison mincemeat. Mincemeat pie used to actually contain meat. The original Depression-era version was made with finely chopped venison, usually neck or shoulder, the cheapest cuts off the deer, slow-cooked with apples, raisins, currants, suet, brown sugar, cider, brandy, and a heavy hand of cinnamon, clove, and nutmeg. The mixture was packed into stoneware crocks and aged for at least a month before pies were baked. By Christmas, the meat had melted into the fruit and spice in a way that was both savory and sweet, with a richness modern fruit pies cannot touch. A single deer taken in November supplied a family with mincemeat through the entire holiday season. Today, you cannot legally sell deer meat in any state. It is illegal to commercially process or distribute wild venison through normal grocery channels. Restaurants serving venison must use farm-raised animals from federally inspected facilities. The pie that defined Depression Christmas tables is now a pie that violates several federal regulations the moment money changes hands. You can still make it, but you cannot sell it. Most Americans never even taste it anymore. Number 9. Crow pie. This one will make you flinch, and it should. The American crow was a common Depression-era food in the rural Midwest and South, particularly in regions where the birds destroyed corn crops. Farmers shot them out of cornfields by the dozens, and the women cleaned and cooked them. The dark meat is closer to duck than chicken, with a strong flavor that benefits from long, slow cooking. The breast was simmered overnight in a vinegar marinade to tenderize it, then baked in a pie with onions, root vegetables, and a thick gravy. 6 crows made one pie. The flavor was rich, gamey, and surprisingly tender. Today, the crow is protected under the Federal Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918, and while limited hunting is permitted in some states during specific seasons, the cooking and consumption is so heavily regulated that almost nobody makes crow pie anymore. Selling crow meat is illegal everywhere in the United States. In 1934, a farmer who shot the crows eating his corn was a farmer feeding his family with the same bullet. The bird that destroyed the harvest paid for itself in supper. Number 8. Pawpaw pudding. The pawpaw is the largest native fruit in North America, and almost no American alive today has ever tasted one. The fruit grows wild from Pennsylvania to Florida, and during the Depression, families gathered them by the bushel from creek banks in late September. The flesh is custard soft, the color of fresh butter, and the flavor is something between a banana, a mango, and a vanilla pudding. Mothers scooped the pulp from the skin, mixed it with sugar, eggs, milk, flour, and butter, and baked it in a casserole dish until it set into a thick golden pudding. The flavor was unlike any other fruit grown commercially in America, sweet, tropical, and unmistakable. The reason you have never tasted one is regulatory. The pawpaw fruit is so fragile that it bruises within 48 hours of harvest, which makes it functionally illegal to ship through commercial produce channels that require a longer shelf life. The USDA does not list it as a permitted commercial crop in most distribution chains. Today you can only taste pawpaw if you find one yourself in the woods in the 3rd week of September. Number 7. Pine bark flour bread. When the wheat ran out, and the cornmeal ran out, and the acorn flour ran out, families in Scandinavian American communities in Minnesota and the Dakotas made bread from the inner bark of the white pine tree. The outer bark was peeled away with a knife, exposing the cambium layer, the soft, pale inner bark that contains starch. This layer was scraped off in long strips, dried in the oven, and ground into a coarse flour. Mixed with rye or wheat flour at a ratio of 1:4, it baked into a dense, slightly sweet bread with a faint resinous flavor that took some getting used to. The technique came from Sweden and Finland, where pine bark bread had been a famine food for centuries. During the Depression, it was made in fewer than 1,000 American households, but it was made. Today, harvesting bark from any living tree on public land is illegal in nearly every state without a forestry permit. The bread that saved Scandinavian American families through the worst winters of the 1930s cannot legally be made today by anyone without their own woodlot. Number 6. Moonshine vanilla extract. Real vanilla extract cost about 30 cents an ounce in 1934. It was far too expensive for a family watching every penny. So mothers made their own. 3 vanilla beans, split lengthwise, were dropped into a pint mason jar of clear corn whiskey. Moonshine, in other words, was whiskey distilled in a copper still by an uncle 3 hollows over. The jar was sealed and stored in a dark cabinet for 6 weeks. The alcohol slowly extracted every aromatic compound from the beans, and the result was a vanilla extract more potent and more flavorful than anything sold commercially. The legal problem was not the extract itself, it was the corn whiskey. Untaxed distilled spirits remain illegal under federal law today, exactly as they were in 1934. A jar of moonshine vanilla extract was technically a federal offense, the same offense that filled American prisons during Prohibition. The grandmothers who made it knew exactly what they were doing. They also knew the federal revenue agent had not been seen in the holler since 1922 and was not coming back. They baked their cakes with 2 teaspoons of it. Nobody ever asked. Third pattern break. Here is what makes this list different from any other list of forgotten recipes. Most of these dishes are not gone because they stopped tasting good. They are gone because the system that allowed them to exist, the system of self-reliant rural households, of free foraging, of home butchering, of shared knowledge passed from grandmother to mother to daughter, was systematically dismantled over the course of the 20th century. Not by accident, by policy. The food industry now generates roughly $800 billion a year in the United States alone. Every dollar of that revenue depends on the assumption that you cannot, or will not, or do not know how to feed yourself from the land around you. The Depression-era cook understood something we have forgotten. Hunger is not solved by money. Hunger is solved by knowledge. A woman who knew which weeds to gather, which trees to bark, which animals to trap, and which roots to brew was a woman who could not be priced into starvation. Number 5. Persimmon pudding. The American persimmon is not the Asian fuyu sold in supermarkets. It is a smaller, wild fruit that grows across the Midwest, and a single bite of an unripe one will lock your jaw shut. Only after the first frost does it turn soft, sweet, and date-like. During the Depression, families gathered them off the ground in October, pulped them through a strainer, and mixed the pulp with sugar, butter, eggs, milk, and flour. Baked for an hour in a deep pan, the pudding came out dark, dense, and almost caramelly, somewhere between dates, butterscotch, and pumpkin. The fruit is too soft to ship, so the USDA has no commercial classification for it. It grows free on roadsides across half the country, and almost nobody under 50 has ever tasted it. Number 4. Backyard chicken slaughter and dumplings. The chicken in this dish was live at noon. By 6 o'clock, it was floating in a pot of dumplings on the stove. Grandmother grabbed the bird by the legs, laid it across a stump, and took its head off with a hatchet in one motion. She plunged it in scalding water, plucked it, gutted it, jointed it, and put it into the pot with onion, salt, and water for an hour. Spoonfuls of dumpling dough went in for the last 20 minutes, swelling into pale, tender clouds that drank up the broth. Today, you can still slaughter your own birds in most states, but you cannot sell the meat, you cannot give it to a neighbor in many jurisdictions, and several cities have banned the practice outright. The dish that defined 1,000 farm Sundays is functionally regulated out of the modern American kitchen. Number 3. Sassafras root beer. Before commercial soft drinks took over the grocery aisle, every rural household in the South made its own root beer from scratch. Sassafras root, black birch bark, a handful of sarsaparilla, a pinch of wintergreen, all simmered in water for an hour, then strained, sweetened, and mixed with yeast. 3 days fermenting in a stoneware crock built natural carbonation. The result was thick, dark, alive, and fizzy, with a flavor nothing like the Coca-Cola product that replaced it. The 1960 FD, a ban on squirrel, killed this recipe overnight. Every root beer in your grocery store now contains synthetic flavoring designed to mimic something the federal government made illegal 65 years ago. The real taste lives only in memory. Number 2. Raw milk, butter, and clabber. Every farm in America in 1934 had a cow that produced more milk than the family could drink. The excess was poured into ceramic pans and left in the spring house to clabber, fermenting naturally from wild lactobacillus in the air. After 2 days, the cream rose thick and slightly sour, was skimmed off, and churned into butter, the color of fresh corn silk, with a tang no commercial butter has ever matched. The clabber that remained was eaten with sugar and cornbread or stirred into biscuits. Today, the sale of raw milk is illegal in 17 states, and the interstate sale is a federal crime. The FDA has prosecuted dairy farmers for selling raw milk to consenting adults. The butter that defined Depression-era farm kitchens cannot legally be sold by anyone in America today. Number 1. Hoover stew. Named, with bitter irony, after the president whose policies many blamed for the Depression itself, Hoover stew fed unemployed families in shanty towns called Hoovervilles from 1930 through 1933. A handful of broken noodles, a can of stewed tomatoes, a diced onion, whatever scraps you could scrounge, usually hot dogs at 6 cents a pound. Sometimes a can of corn from the church food pantry, everything in one pot, simmered for 30 minutes, then ladled into tin bowls. It cost about 15 cents to feed a family of 6. The meal was named in mockery, but eaten in earnest. Hoover stew kept families alive when unemployment hit 25%. There is no specific regulation that makes this dish illegal today. The illegality is structural. Every ingredient that defined it, the cheap broken pasta, the unbranded canned tomatoes, the day-old hot dog, the church pantry corn, has been reformed and rebranded into a food system where the version your great-grandmother made cannot be assembled in 2026 for 15 cents. The recipe still exists. The economics that made it possible were destroyed. That is the deepest illegality of all. Make one of these this week, just one. Drop your pick in the comments, because these were not just recipes, they were the tools of a generation that did not need a permit to feed their children. Your grandmother knew. Now you know too.